When I talk about Stellantis, I mean the Dodge Caravan, the Jeep Grand Cherokee, the Jeep Compass, the Jeep Wrangler, the Chrysler Pacifica. And I was clear at my committee appearance at Indu, Stellantis is on the hook. Within a day of Stellantis announcements on October 15th, I sent a letter to Antonio Filosa, the global CEO of Stellantis, stating that the company's actions were unacceptable and that we expected them to honor their legally binding commitments to the government of Canada. On October 20th, I summoned Jeff Hines, the then Canadian CEO of Stellantis, for a meeting in Ottawa, joined by Vic Fideli, Ontario's Minister of Economic Development, and Lana Payne, National President of Unifor. On October 23rd, together with the Minister of Finance, we announced a 50% reduction in Stellantis' annual remission quota. That means Stellantis has 50% less of a market for its cars without tariffs in our country. On October 30th, I went to Brampton to meet with the strong men and women who build the backbone of Canada's auto industry to let them know that we'll always fight for them. On November 3rd, I triggered the formal dispute resolution process under the contracts. And today, on December 4th, I'm formally announcing that we're serving Stellantis with a notice of default under the contracts.
We're jumping right into what feels, it really feels like a corporate divorce filed in the middle of a global investment race.
That's a good way to put it. This is not your standard labor dispute, not at all.
Right. This is a high-stakes corporate drama that has very quickly escalated into a major international trade standoff. We're talking about billions of dollars, the livelihoods of thousands of Canadian workers, and really the entire future structure of North America's EV supply chain.
And it all started with an extremely blunt announcement.
Yeah.
One of the world's biggest automakers threatening to, significantly shrink its manufacturing footprint in Canada.
And the Canadian government's response was just immediate and sharp.
Mm-hmm. It wasn't some polite request to negotiate. It was an angry, very public outcry, backed by a very clear, unambiguous threat of legal action.
So that initial news, that bombshell, dropped on October 14th, and it all centered on Stellantis.
Right.
The company announced this massive, and I mean massive, $13 billion investment program focused heavily on its U.S. operations.
And the real flashpoint for Canada was the plan to move production of the Jeep Compass.
A very popular model.
A huge volume model. And they plan to move it from the long-standing Brampton assembly plant in Ontario down to the newly reopened Belvidere plant in Illinois.
And that move to Belvidere, it's serious. It's not just talk. It's backed by over $600 million in dedicated investment from Stellantis.
Exactly. This wasn't just some long-term possibility they were floating. This is a concrete plan to move Canadian manufacturing output right across the border. When you look at the sources, this conflict really it crystallized a very dangerous moment for Canadian manufacturing.
So our deep dive today is all about pulling out that crucial context. We have to unpack what exactly Stellantis is being accused of. What commitments were broken and over what kind of time frame.
And why is this happening now? Is it just corporate cost cutting, or are there deeper, maybe unavoidable macroeconomic forces at play?
And then we'll get into Canada's reaction. From the aggressive legal threats to its pretty innovative economic countermoves. Okay, let's unpack this. We have a high-stakes trade standoff intersecting with billions in green investment.
And our mission here is to understand what this all means for you, whether you're an investor, a policy analyst, or just, curious about how these huge decisions get made.
What do these pressures mean for the long-term outcome of Canada's entire auto industry, especially as it tries to pivot so aggressively toward a full end-to-end EV supply chain?
We need to get past the headlines and understand the fundamental mechanics driving these corporate and governmental decisions.
All right, let's start with the scale of Stellantis' commitment to the U.S. because the numbers are just staggering. It helps you understand why Canada is feeling so marginalized here. We're talking about a $13 billion program. What specifically is that investment actually buying for the American side of their operation?
Well, it's transformative for them. It represents a major strategic shift towards, let's call it, U.S. consolidation. That $13 billion is set to introduce 5 new models, add a completely new 4-cylinder engine production line, and critically, create more than 5,000 new jobs.
Wow. And where are those jobs going?
They're spread across plants in key states, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana. And it gets bigger. Stellantis has explicitly said it wants to lift its annual U.S. vehicle output by 50% from where it is now.
50%. That's a wholesale restructuring.
It is. And they're rolling out 19 refreshed products across all U.S. assembly facilities, with updated powertrains planned all the way through 2029.
So this isn't a temporary boost. This is aimed at significantly boosting their U.S. capacity and I guess their long-term security there. And the specific flashpoint is that plant in Illinois, Belvedere.
Exactly. They're sinking over $600 million into reopening that one facility. The plan is explicitly to expand production of the Jeep Cherokee and, critically, the Jeep Compass.
And the timeline for the Compass.
The initial output is slated for 2027. And that date, 2027, is incredibly important because it gives the Canadian government a concrete target to focus its legal and economic fight against. This isn't some hypothetical 10 years down the road.
It's 2 years away.
It's right around the corner.
Which brings us to the core of the Canadian grievance, this idea of a broken commitment. Canada's industry minister, Melanie Joly, she wrote a very strong public letter directly to the Stellantis CEO, Antonio Filosa. What was the central accusation in that letter?
The language was very direct. The minister stated, and I'm quoting here, that Stellantis had previously committed to maintaining its Canadian footprint, including at Brampton, in return for significant public funding that the government had extended over decades.
So the Canadian view is that all that public money, which has to be in the billions over the years?
Oh, absolutely, billion.
It wasn't a gift. It was a contractual exchange for keeping plants like Brampton running.
That's the heart of it. Let's dig into that a bit because it explains the severity of the reaction. These deals are really complex. They're often tied to multi-year investment cycles, promises about which models will be built where.
So governments, federal and provincial, have provided billions in grants and loans and incentives for things like modernization and retooling.
Right. And the unspoken agreement, which is often actually a written agreement, is that in exchange for this financial stability, the automaker commits to specific mandates, like keeping a particular assembly plant running and giving it a high-volume model to build.
And the Brampton plant has been a recipient of that kind of aid for a long time.
Repeatedly over its entire lifetime.
So when Minister Joly calls the move unacceptable, she's basically saying that by moving the Jeep Compass, a huge seller, Stellantis is pulling a critical leg out from under the stool that keeps Brampton viable.
And in doing so, breaching the spirit, if not the actual letter, of those decades-old agreements.
She said it directly jeopardizes the future of the facility and its unionized workforce.
She did. She acknowledged that the U.S. tariff environment creates complex challenges, but she forcefully insisted that Stellantis still made important commitments to Canada and that Canadians expect them to honor those commitments. It really challenges the whole idea of public-private partnerships.
And she wasn't just asking for a change of heart. The letter demanded that Stellantis quickly identify new mandates for Brampton and also insisted that contracts with Canadian part suppliers be honored.
But the real leverage, the thing that immediately ratcheted up the tension, was the legal threat.
That was the centerpiece of the response.
It was unequivocal. She wrote in the letter to Filosa, "Should Stellantis choose not to respect its obligations, we will act in the interests of all Canadians and hold the company to full account and exercise all options, including legal."
That wording, it implies that any move away from maintaining their Canadian footprint would be treated as a legal default under their existing agreements with both the federal government and Ontario. So what could that mean? Are we talking about trying to claw back past subsidies?
That is the most likely outcome, yes. If the government exercises all options, including legal, they'd be aiming for two things. First, they could try to seek what's called specific performance, which would be compelling Stellantis to give an equally valuable model to Brampton.
But that seems unlikely.
It's very difficult to force a company to do that. So more likely, they would seek financial damages. And that means starting a process to claw back some, or maybe all, of the huge financial support they've given Stellantis over the years.
On the grounds of breach of contract.
Exactly. For non-performance.
That sets a pretty dangerous precedent, doesn't it? It connects decades of financial support directly to day-to-day operational decisions. To treat a plant relocation as a breach of contract is, that's about as aggressive as a government can get, short of just imposing punitive tariffs itself.
It absolutely sets a precedent. It essentially converts historical government aid from just general business support into these performance-based long-term contracts for production volumes and jobs.
And if they pursue this and win...
Every automaker in Canada that has ever taken government money has to be rereading the fine print of their agreements right now. It's a very tense negotiation, but one Canada clearly feels is necessary to maintain its credibility, especially with all the huge EV investments they're making.
Right. That gives us the what and the how of the reaction. Now we have to get to the essential why.
The macroeconomic drivers.
We have this dramatic confrontation, so now we have to pivot to the fundamental economic forces that would drive a company like Stellantis to make a $13 billion bet on reshoring to the U.S., even if it means a political firestorm in Canada. The minister herself mentioned the U.S. tariff environment. What's happening there?
The primary driver, according to pretty much every detailed economic assessment, is the huge and, frankly, volatile shift in U.S. trade policy. We are looking at an environment of economic uncertainty that we haven't seen since the height of the pandemic.
And it's leading to what experts are calling a new paradigm in the North American auto industry.
It is. Companies are now optimizing for political risk, not just pure cost efficiency anymore.
Can you break down the specific policies? What are the tariffs that are making Canada less attractive for production right now, even with the new NAFTA, the USMCA?
Well, there are two major policies causing this instability. First, the U.S. has implemented a 25% tariff on finished automotive imports generally.
But Canada and Mexico were exempt from that, right?
They were granted partial exemptions, yes. But the risk that those exemptions could be removed or changed at any time, that risk remains high. And that uncertainty is just corrosive when you're planning multi-billion-dollar investments that span decades.
And the second policy, that one targets the supply chain itself.
Yes, and that's where the real pain point is. There's a 25% tariff on imported automobile parts. Now, USMCA-compliant parts are exempt, but just navigating the complexity of proving compliance and the documentation for these highly integrated supply chains is a massive administrative and financial burden.
So companies are just looking for simplicity. Less border exposure.
Exactly. So if you're Stellantis and you're building a car in Canada to sell in the U.S., you're navigating those tariffs, you're navigating the risk, and it starts to look a lot more attractive to just build the vehicle entirely within your largest target market, which is the U.S.
But there's another factor, right? A more direct financial subsidy from the U.S. government?
That's the other and maybe more powerful factor. The U.S. is offering a temporary but very material financial offset to its domestic manufacturers to help with those parts tariffs.
Okay, let's get into the specifics of that. How powerful is that incentive?
It's very compelling, especially in the short term. For the first year, which is 2025, the offset is equal to 3.75% of the MSRP of the U.S. produced vehicle.
So on a typical Jeep Compass with an MSRP of $35,000, 3.75% of that is what, almost $1,700?
It's $1,687.50, to be precise.
So you're saying the U.S. government is effectively handing a manufacturer like Stellantis nearly $1,700 for every single vehicle just for building it in the U.S. instead of Canada.
That's correct. And after 1 year, that offset drops to 2.5%, and it's gone completely after 2 years. But that initial boost is material enough to swing a decision on a high-volume model like the Compass.
Especially when you combine it with the costs and risks of the Canadian operation.
It effectively subsidizes U.S. domestic production right now, increasing the cost difference compared to Canadian manufacturing, even if Canadian labor might traditionally be a bit lower.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't just about one plant. It's about how U.S. trade policy is fundamentally reshaping North American supply chains. The TD Economics assessment called the expected outcome a protracted decoupling. What does that mean, and why is it protracted instead of just happening all at once?
A protracted decoupling means a gradual structural break in this highly integrated auto sector. It's not immediate because the supply chain is just too complex and too expensive to move overnight.
You mentioned the Linamont anecdote earlier. It's worth reminding us of that journey again.
It's the perfect example. A single automatic transmission component. It starts as scrap metal in Guelph, Ontario. It travels to Pennsylvania to be smelted, then to Ohio to be made into a hub. Then it comes back to Linamar in Guelph for assembly.
That's already 3 border crossings.
We're not done. It then gets parts from Illinois and Mexico for more assembly, moves to the U.S. Midwest to become part of a full transmission, and then finally heads back to an Ontario plant to be installed in a car.
That's 7 border crossings for one component.
7. Optimized over decades for peak efficiency. You can't just move that kind of process quickly without incurring catastrophic costs, so the decoupling is protracted.
And what's the end result for consumers?
higher costs. In the short term, from the direct impact of the tariffs, and in the long term, even higher prices as manufacturers try to recoup the billions of dollars it costs to reshore their capacity to avoid future tariff shocks.
So Stellantis is reacting to this environment by consolidating where they feel the long-term political risk is lowest and the immediate financial incentives are highest.
Even if the move itself triggers a diplomatic crisis with Canada, it's an optimization calculation. The risk of keeping production in Canada, only to have a new U.S. administration impose even harsher tariffs in a few years, is seen as greater than the short-term cost of moving the mandate and facing Canada's anger.
This environment of volatile U.S. trade policy forces companies to prioritize certainty over traditional cost metrics.
It's the new paradigm.
So we've established Stellantis is moving because of U.S. tariffs and incentives. Canada is now fighting back on two fronts: the legal threat, which is about old contracts, and its own economic retaliation, which is about shaping new behavior. What were the specific countermoves on the trade side?
Canada's primary countermove was to implement its own retaliatory tariffs of 25% on vehicles imported from the U.S. This is a classic reciprocal measure.
Okay, but how does that 25% tariff actually work? Since the market is so integrated, it can't just be a blanket tax on every car coming from the U.S., can it?
No, and that's the ingenious part of the design. Canada's tariff applies only to the content value sourced outside of Canada and Mexico. In other words, the non-USMCA compliant content.
So they're protecting the North American part of the supply chain.
They're trying to. The Canadian government's calculation assumes, by default, that 15% of any vehicle's content value originates in Canada or Mexico.
Okay, so let's use an example. A $50,000 truck comes across the border from Michigan into Ontario.
Right. So we assume 15% of that, or $7,500, is compliant North American content that's exempt from the tariff. The remaining $42,500, or 85% of the value, is subject to the 25% tariff.
And 25% of that is over $10,000.
$1,625. An effective tariff rate of roughly 21% on the total vehicle cost. It's a massive immediate price hike.
Wow. But the most aggressive and, innovative part of Canada's strategy is what they're calling the tariff offset mechanism.
This is the real industrial policy tool, yes. The government is essentially offering a discount to manufacturers who play ball.
Who behave, right.
Exactly. The government is offering this tariff offset specifically for the major manufacturers that produce vehicles inside Canada: GM, Ford, Stellantis, Honda, and Toyota. Think of it less as a discount and more as a mandatory loyalty program.
And what are the conditions for this loyalty program?
The offset is quota-based, so it applies to a certain volume of vehicles, and it is strictly conditional on manufacturers continuing to produce in Canada and Floranda maintaining their existing investments.
So if Stellantis moves the compass and doesn't replace it,
they risk losing this offset. The explicit goal of the design is to, quote, incentivize automakers that produce domestically in Canada to maintain their current production investment levels.
that connects right back to the Stellantis conflict. Canada is using its own tariff structure, not just to retaliate against the U.S., but as a direct negotiating tool to compel compliance. If Stellantis cuts production, they lose this critical benefit on potentially hundreds of thousands of vehicles they sell in Canada every year.
It's powerful. The tariff offset is very material, potentially affecting up to 60% of all vehicle sales in Canada, based on 2024 figures for those domestic producers.
So for these multinationals, staying competitive in the Canadian market is now directly tied to keeping their Canadian plants running.
Exactly. It means companies like Toyota and Honda, who've recently strengthened their Canadian manufacturing, might be in a much better financial position than the Detroit Three, who are under all this pressure to reshore capacity to the U.S.
This just highlights how desperate the fight is. The whole system was built for global efficiency, and now everyone is building these balls to force localized, higher-cost production.
And that's what makes this whole decoupling process so costly. As you said, these supply chains were developed over years to optimize everything. Trying to shift them because of tariffs is a multi-billion-dollar game of musical chairs.
And the consumer always ends up footing the bill.
Always. Canada's strategy is to create enough financial pain through tariffs on imports, while simultaneously offering massive relief, the offset, tied strictly to domestic performance. It's a very sophisticated defense.
A defense that acknowledges they can't afford to just lose their entire manufacturing base to U.S. trade policy.
They are leveraging their domestic market size as a tool of industrial policy.
So Canada's auto sector is caught in this perfect storm. You've got the decoupling driven by U.S. tariffs, and then you have the internal pressure of transitioning from combustion engines to EVs. Let's look at the contrasting trends shaping the future, especially in Ontario.
The structural contraction is undeniable. It's severe. Canadian vehicle production fell by nearly 45% between 2016 and 2024.
45%.
It's a huge drop, from 2.35 million units down to just 1.29 million. And sure, the pandemic and chip shortages were a factor, but this long decline signals deeper structural challenges. Mainly, the massive retooling needed to shift from sedans to SUVs and now to EVs.
That drop is alarming. But at the same time, Ontario, which is 86% of Canada's entire auto sector GDP, has secured this unprecedented investment boom, over $46 billion in auto and EV-related investments since 2020.
That's an incredible dichotomy.
So how do we reconcile a massive contraction with a massive investment boom?
It's a high-risk bet on the future. The governments in Canada are basically conceding that the high-volume, lower-margin work, like the Compass at Brampton, might be structurally lost to the U.S. because of politics and incentives.
But they're aggressively using public money to capture the next generation of manufacturing.
The higher-value stuff, batteries, components, specialized EV assembly, they're aiming to scale up to 400,000 electric and hybrid vehicles a year by 2030.
Let's talk about the big wins first. Volkswagen.
That's the most prominent example. VW committed $7 billion for their first overseas EV battery cell plant in St. Thomas. This is a massive 90-gigawatt-hour gigafactory.
It's hard to visualize what that means.
It means it'll have the capacity to produce enough batteries for about 1 million EVs every single year. It opens in 2027. It's a foundational piece of Canada's future.
And Stellantis, despite the Brampton fight, is still moving ahead with its battery plant in Windsor.
Correct. That's a different part of the picture. Stellantis and LG are building a $5 billion battery facility in Windsor. That one has a capacity of about 49.5 gigawatt hours, enough for about 450,000 EVs a year.
And that one is already starting up.
Battery module production actually began there in October 2024. The government's calculation is that losing one assembly mandate is bad, but losing the entire future of the battery supply chain would be a catastrophe.
So those are huge foundational investments, but the uncertainty we've been talking about, it's chilling other deals. Let's talk about the uncertainty, starting with Honda.
Honda's story is a perfect illustration of how fast things can shift. In 2024, Honda announced a monumental $15 billion investment, 4 new facilities, an EV assembly plant, a 36-gigawatt-hour battery plant in Alliston.
What then?
But then, in May 2025, less than a year later, Honda announced they were postponing both the EV assembly and battery plants by at least 2 years.
And the reason they gave?
Explicitly changing market conditions and a slowdown in the EV market. A $15 billion bet gets put on hold. It shows how fragile these commitments are, even with government incentives. Market risk is now trumping geopolitical risk, at least for now.
And it's not just the big assembly plants, it's the deeper supply chain too. Tell us about Umicore.
Umicore's situation is really troubling because it hits the deepest part of the supply chain. They were building a $2.76 billion CAM plant.
Okay, break that down for us. CAM.
Cathode active material and its precursor. These are the essential chemical compounds, the processed nickel, manganese, and cobalt that go into the very heart of the battery cell. It's the most valuable part of an EV battery.
So Umicore's facility was critical for Canada's claim to an end-to-end supply chain, connecting their minerals to the final batteries.
Exactly. And this project, supported by almost $1 billion in government funding, has had construction pause since July 2024, also citing a slowdown in EV sales.
So if you don't have that local CAM production,
you remain dependent on highly volatile international markets, often China. This pause proves the transition is complex, it's hard to time correctly, and it's very susceptible to market dips.
So with these contractions and postponements, how is the Ontario government trying to stabilize the workforce? We're talking about over 110,000 workers, with most of them in parts manufacturing.
That's a small city's worth of people. And the skills needed for EV manufacturing, battery maintenance, software integration are fundamentally different from traditional assembly line work.
So the policy response has to be about skills.
Heavily. In May 2025, the Ontario government committed an additional $1 billion to the Skills Development Fund.
$1 billion is a massive commitment. Is that enough to reskill over 100,000 workers?
It provides the capacity and the cushion, but the challenge is immense. The fund is designed to help train and reskill workers, especially those hit by tariffs and layoffs. It's about ensuring the workers on legacy equipment are prepared for the new EV ecosystem.
And beyond just training, what other policies are they using?
They're focusing on incentivizing modernization and R&D. A key tool is the Ontario-made Manufacturing Investment Tax Credit. It's a refundable credit to incentivize investments in new machinery and equipment in Ontario.
So they're trying to lock down the domestic part suppliers, the Linamars and Magnus of the world?
Exactly. Incentivize them to modernize and stay put, even as the global landscape shifts. And they're also leveraging R&D centers, like the Charge Lab and Mark at McMaster, to make sure Canada remains a hub for the high-value intellectual property, even if some assembly work shifts south.
It's a dual strategy. Fight hard on trade to keep existing plants running, while pouring money into training and R&D to secure the next generation of jobs.
It's a very expensive, resilient strategy. And remember, the current battery supply chain is so dependent on China. This $46 billion bet by Canada isn't just economic, it's a geopolitical move to secure North American energy and transportation independence. The stakes are immense.
Which is why they're fighting Stellantis so hard over what they see as a breach of contract.
It all connects.
So we have the confrontation, the powerful macroeconomic drivers, and Canada's comprehensive defensive strategy. Let's look at the near-term economic projections for 2025, assuming these tariffs stay in place. What's the predicted financial impact on sales and prices for you, the consumer?
Assuming the tariffs remain for all of 2025, the forecasts are pretty clear. It means a sales contraction across the continent. In the U.S., vehicle sales are expected to decline by 4% fourth quarter over fourth quarter.
And in Canada,
The drop is expected to be even sharper, a decline of 7.5% Q4 over Q4 in 2025.
why the bigger drop in Canada?
A couple of reasons. First, the Canadian economy is just far more reliant on trade with the U.S. than the other way around. Any trade friction just hits the smaller economy harder. Second, with Canada's overall economic growth expected to be below 1% this year, that sluggishness acts as another headwind. So you couple that with the direct effect of the auto tariffs, and vehicle prices across the board are expected to rise by thousands of dollars.
So that volatility isn't free. The consumer pays for it.
The consumer absolutely pays for trade instability.
That's the immediate pain. What's the long-term forecast for where production actually settles?
The long-term forecast anticipates a gradual reallocation of production towards the U.S. over the next few years. But that shift is likely to be moderate, especially in the near term,
Why moderate?
because manufacturers will first use up the existing unused production capacity in the U.S., which is about 1.6 million units a year. That's the most efficient way for them to expand quickly to get those 3.75% offsets we talked about.
But building massive new plants in the U.S., that has to be a risky proposition right now.
It is extremely risky, and this is the major break on a bigger, faster structural shift. Building a new multi-billion-dollar plant takes years, and the timeline would likely coincide pretty closely with the 2028 U.S. election.
And the outcome of that election could just reverse the very trade policies the automakers are trying to avoid.
Exactly. That long-term political uncertainty acts as a governor on a massive reallocation right now. Companies are hedging their bets, which makes them vulnerable to Canada's defensive strategy.
So Canadian and Mexican production will likely decline a bit, but Canada has this powerful targeted tool to mitigate the worst of the damage.
And this is where Canada's clever tariff design is so critical. The retaliatory tariffs, specifically the offsets tied to maintaining domestic production, act as a strong, explicit incentive for automakers to maintain their current investment levels in Canada.
It forces them to treat their Canadian operations as a critical part of their North American sales strategy, not just some auxiliary component.
Precisely.
So what does this all mean? The Canadian auto sector is navigating a perfect storm of trade volatility and technological transition, but it's using targeted policy to fight back.
Right.
The outcome seems to be less of a complete collapse and more of a managed contraction in legacy ICE production,
Yeah.
balanced by these massive geopolitically driven EV investments.
That's a good summary. It's complex and contradictory.
Good.
The Stellantis conflict is a direct result of U.S. trade policy uncertainty hitting these unfulfilled long-term investment commitments. Canada's reaction is this calculated mix of legal threats and smart tariff structuring.
And the immediate future involves some production shifting south, but that's balanced by Canada's aggressive $46 billion investment in the EV supply chain and its billion-dollar push for workforce upskilling.
It's a high-stakes gamble on both sides. Canada is betting that the long-term value of being the sole, politically reliable North American source for the EV battery supply chain will offset the decline in legacy production.
And they're trying to make sure that transition doesn't leave 110,000 workers behind.
But we have to remember, the path forward is still so uncertain. Even the secured investments are fragile. Honda delayed its $15 billion project. Umicore paused its $2.76 billion facility.
The market slowdown in EVs, combined with trade volatility, means the groundwork is set, but the timing and success are far from guaranteed.
The integration of the North American auto sector was a decades-long process that maximized efficiency. That one Linamar component crossing 7 borders illustrates it perfectly.
And now, as the continent tries to decouple and reshore production, we're already seeing massive price increases for consumers and these significant investment slowdowns.
Which brings us to our final thought. Consider how much longer multinational corporations can afford to make these multi-billion-dollar bets on manufacturing locations, when a single election cycle could just negate the trade policies they're trying to avoid. It could render a decade of strategic planning completely obsolete overnight.
This instability fundamentally alters the definition of a safe investment.
And it makes economic volatility a permanent manufacturing cost for the foreseeable future. That instability is exactly what we're seeing play out in the Stellantis standoff.